Do you desire a healthier relationship with technology, especially social media? The Luddite Club welcomes you and your ideas. These students are throwing away their smartphones and getting flip phones instead. Sometimes they're meeting outside so that they can only use natural light. And generally, they're trying to figure out what our relationship with modern technology should be. This is a new kind of movement, one that I think we're going to see more of, because my suspicion is that we are now living in a time of techno-pessimism, where generally we saw technology as something that only improved our lives. Every new piece of technology was a bit of progress. People are starting to ask difficult questions about technology. They're looking around at the world that we've built with this technology, and sometimes they're saying, no, I don't want that. There's a long history of philosophers writing about, criticizing, and even resisting new technologies. And in fact, it goes all the way back to Plato. Plato wasn't concerned with smartphones or the internet when he was writing about technology. When Plato writes about technology, he's writing about writing itself. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates tells the story of Thoof and Thomas. Thoof is an Egyptian god who is associated with wisdom, with arithmetic, and importantly for this story, with the invention of writing. In this story, Thoof brings Thomas a range of new inventions, and he promises that each one is going to make the Egyptians' lives better. Thoof kind of says what all technologists say, that this is going to improve the human condition. And Thomas sees some of them and he approves of some of them and he disapproves of others. But Socrates lingers on the presentation of writing. Thoof promises that writing would make the Egyptians wiser and it would improve their memories. But this is where Thomas says that he's gone too far. Thomas actually compares Thoof's perspective to that of a parent who can't see the faults in their own child. And so he's going to need someone else to take a look at his invention and tell him where things could go wrong. And Thomas says that writing won't improve our memories. In fact, it will increase forgetfulness. He concludes his criticism by saying that the Egyptians will be hearers of many things and will have learned nothing, and that they will have the show of wisdom, but not the reality. Socrates goes on to compare writing to painting, saying that painting takes something that's alive and creates a copy of it, but the copy, unlike the original, is dead. It lacks some of the crucial, vital features of the original. And he thinks writing is a lot like this, because you can't ask a text a question. You can't, really interrogate it. No matter what you say back to a text, it is always going to be saying the same thing. Speech is alive, Socrates is saying, but writing is dead. As with all of the Platonic dialogues, it can be difficult to figure out what Socrates' point is or what Plato intends to teach. It's difficult, if not impossible, to know what the historical Socrates believed. After all, Plato is using him as a character, and we shouldn't assume that whatever Socrates says in the dialogues is actually what Socrates, like the historical Socrates, would have believed. And we can't consult any of Socrates' writings because he never wrote anything down. There is a historical document called the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers that gives short biographies of important philosophers, particularly from ancient Greece. And Socrates has an entry there. And it's mentioned that Socrates wrote two things. One of them was a hymn of praise to the gods, but its authenticity was disputed even in the ancient world. And the other is a fable. Now, there is a mention of a fable in another Platonic dialogue, the Phaedo, where Socrates mentions that in between being sentenced to death and actually being executed, he has spent his time creating a verse based on one of Aesop's fable. And primarily, the Socratic legacy is an oral tradition. Socrates taught many philosophers, and they would go on to found schools of philosophy in Greece. Plato, of course, is the most famous example of this. Socrates preferred a dialogical model of doing philosophy. That's what we see throughout the dialogues. He'll be at a party, or he'll be in a marketplace, or he'll just find someone walking to court, and he'll start asking them questions. And all of the philosophical inquiry happens in the back and forth. A definition is proposed, he asks a difficult question, and then they see if they can revise the definition. A famous work like The Republic, which is centered on simply one question, why be just or why be moral, is an extended conversation between Socrates and several interlocutors, particularly Glaucon, Thrasymachus, and Adeimantus. And perhaps Socrates believed that by writing down philosophy, you would lose this dialogical character of the act itself. And so he never did. And while his student Plato did go on to write down some of his philosophy. That's why we have the dialogues. There is a reference in Aristotle to the unwritten teachings of Plato, suggesting perhaps that there were some parts of Platonic philosophy that needed to be passed down orally rather than being written down. So we see this early skepticism about a new technology. Now, something weird is already happening here, because you might think it's strange to call writing a technology. It's just part of what human beings do, right? But this is actually a weird fact about technology in general, that technology, as it becomes more enmeshed in our lives, fades into the background, and we don't even think of it as technology anymore. But as Walter Ong writes in his book, Orality and Literacy, the development of the technology of writing transformed human consciousness. Particularly, it transformed how we thought about reason and memory. Ong is praising writing in that book, particularly because writing allows us to store information so easily, and so we can just retrieve it whenever we need it. It doesn't have to take up much cognitive space. But he notes that there are downsides. They're the same sort of downsides that are mentioned by Plato and Socrates, namely our relationship to our memory changes. We become more forgetful because we can rely on things like writing and increasingly things like hard drives to store information for us. We didn't practice remembering, and so in some ways, we've forgotten how to do it. One way to understand this point is to think that every piece of technology comes with some kind of benefit and some kind of cost. And as we're wondering what our relationship with technology should be, we should compare the cost and the benefits. And we can ask ourselves just this question: is this piece of technology worth the cost? Socrates seemed to think that writing wasn't worth the cost. I think most of us would disagree with Socrates on that point and think that, in fact, writing was a civilization-building tool, and it transformed human consciousness in such a way that we wouldn't want to go back. But we should still be aware of the fact that it did carry a cost, and every new piece of technology does. The advent of the calculator made us worse at doing arithmetic in our heads, right? It's an easy example. It's an example everyone likes to bring up because for some of us, it happened in our lifetime. As soon as you had a calculator in your pocket at all times, you didn't have to worry about things like basic division and subtraction and multiplication. Neil Postman develops some of these themes in his book Technopoly, where he writes that technology has an ecological impact. It's not only that technology adds something to our lives, it's that it transforms the environment around us. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that technology can transform how we see the world. And this can be a good thing, but of course it can also be a bad thing. That's the theme I want to explore in the rest of this video. How does technology shape us? How does technology shape how we see the world? And the new Luddites that we see on college campuses are asking exactly these questions. And that's what I find so interesting about them. But the roots of this movement actually go back pretty far in history. First, we have the original Luddites. Now, if you've encountered the term Luddite before, it's probably been as an insult. We use it as a description of someone who is maybe too stubborn or too stupid to adopt whatever the latest technology is. And it can mean that someone is regressive and that they can't keep up with the times, though there are some people who would proudly call themselves Luddites. But this idea of someone just being stubborn and regressive, I don't think it's a very good description of the original Luddites. I wanted to look into this a little bit, and so I read from Brian Merton's book, Blood in the Machine, which is about, in large part, the Luddites. The Luddites emerged during the Industrial Revolution in England, and at the center of all of these issues was the wool industry, which made up a huge part of the English economy at the time. And because of new innovations like the power loom and eventually steam power, we saw a huge disruption in the lives of these workers. And they found themselves being automated out of a job. And there were people who were going to get very rich because of this, but they weren't the workers themselves. Around this time, we also saw the rise of the factory system. And these factories were seen as highly oppressive places. Orphans were sometimes recruited to come and work in these factories, and they would be promised really nice lives. They would be promised nice, filling meals, a place to sleep. Sometimes they would even be promised that they could ride horses. And then if they worked until they were 21, they would be able to enter into the workforce and work as professionals. That was the promise. In some factories that were in Cromford, it employed about 2,000 workers, and nearly 2/3 of those workers were children, and some of them were as young as 6 years old. Merchant describes the experience of these orphans in some length in his book, and one image that was particularly striking to me was the orphans being delivered to the factory in the first place. People would ride around and try to recruit these orphans, making these promises to them. And then they would put them in basically cages to transport them there. And townspeople would watch them and, with looks of sadness on their face because they knew what terrible lives these orphans were going to live. What had previously been a place where, some skilled workers could make decent livings became a place that primarily was hiring orphans and was treating them terribly. And if you're living through it at the time and you're seeing these new technologies arrive, like the power loom, like steam power, like the factory system, it's hard to look at that and say, yes, this is progress. And it's around this time that the story of Ned Ludd starts to get told. Now, Ned Ludd was a mythic figure. I don't believe there is any historical evidence that he actually existed. He's a bit like Robin Hood in this regard. But the story that was told about Ned Ludd was that he was learning to use a knitting frame, and his master told the magistrate that his apprentice was being lazy. And so Ludd was actually ordered whipped. After he was whipped, he was so angry that he smashed the knitting frame, and then he flees to Sherwood Forest. And workers followed his example of smashing the knitting frames. Sometimes they would destroy, the machines. Sometimes they would set fire to the factories, and they would band together in these groups, and they would write letters explaining why they were doing what they were doing. And the leaders would always sign the letters with the name General Ludd. This, as far as I know, was the first kind of big revolt against big tech. We can draw a little bit more on Neil Postman to see what was happening during the Luddite movement. The invention of these automated technologies and factories, I would say, encouraged the owners of the factories, the people who controlled the factories, to start viewing their workers like parts in a machine. And the thing about being parts in a machine is that when one of them breaks or doesn't work that well, you just throw it away and you replace it. So one way to understand the Luddites, I would say, were people who were standing up for human dignity in the face of technological innovation. So we're going a little bit out on a limb here,